I'll try to give a shortened version of a class I have been working on, I have been giving before. And you should know this is very difficult to figure out who is Benjamin Franklin. I've done a lot of historical research over the last decades, and I found this was the most difficult job I ever had, was to figure out who was Benjamin Franklin, because he was he's such a slandered person that it takes a lot of work. Well, if we talk about Benjamin Franklin, what comes to your mind? Electricity? What? Okay.
We have a republic if you can keep it.
We have a republic if you can keep it. Other things? Womanizer. Ooh, yeah. Male macho womanizer. Yeah, that's right. Any other things?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Okay. Independence Hall. I mean, when I read these books, I read 6 or 7 books, and then I said, oh my goodness, I can't figure out this guy, because every single book portrayed him as an old fuddy-duddy, womanizer, kind of just like a practical American, who's just kind of like practical and gets things done, and he has a long life, and then a womanizer. I mean, that's, and I read a couple of books on Benjamin Franklin and science, and one of them, after reading, 300 pages of Benjamin Franklin and science, the lady who writes the book, in the very end, and one of the last pages says, okay, too bad the American Revolution came in the way, because if it wasn't for the American Revolution, then Benjamin Franklin could have stayed the rest of his life in London and worked at the Royal Academy of Sciences. And then she goes on and says again, this American Revolution really came in a way because God knows what Benjamin Franklin could have accomplished if it hadn't been for the American Revolution. That's after a whole book. And this was not the only one. One book after the other. You have one example. One example is he writes a letter to one of his French lady friends when he's in France in the end of his life, called, I think it's called on Ephemeris or on mayflies, one thing or the other, because mayflies only becomes 24 hours old and then they die. And people think this is some kind of like a love letter. It's not a love letter. It's an intense attack on the physiocrats who had a paper called Ephemeral, and on and on. So you really have the best way to figure out who Benjamin Franklin is to read Graham's book and reread it. Maybe if you read it when you first became a member, it was a little bit rough to read. Reread this. And then you have to read his letters and his articles. He's biting, he's sharp, his satire. He is a real delight to read. So you can begin to figure out how his mind is functioning. What I decided to do today was to pick out a number of quotes that I normally would not do. But he is so sharp in his writing that if you are going to kind of just explain it, you don't get how his mind is functioning. So we're going to have the text up there, and then Nick is going to read so you can get a little sense of how his mind is functioning. So first of all, so let's get going. Let's get into it. So you know all that I think Harley in the beginning of the year gave a presentation of Benjamin Franklin, because this is the 300th anniversary of his birthday. And what we really are celebrating, which I hope I can get a little glimmer of, but we're really celebrating, when you're celebrating his birthday, we're celebrating what the United States represent and what the limb represents. And also, I think very important, this nation's heritage and this nation's capability to fight. Remember, after the elections, some of the Europeans said, what happened in America could not happen in any country in Europe. This kind of bouncing back, which is a social heritage in the United States that comes from people like Benjamin Franklin, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Lyndon LaRouche today, and others, but just to mention some of the key. indeed, Benjamin Franklin, in his own day, the oligarchy knew what he was for kind of a character. So the House of Lords wrote about him. Benjamin Franklin is one of the bitterest and most mischievous enemy this country has ever known. That's from the House of Lords in London. So from Benjamin is very young, and I hope I'll be able to illustrate that. He uses, I mean, from his 15 and on, he uses his entire life to build up the colonies and to lead in all his actions towards the crowning of his life's work, namely participating in formulating the Declaration of Independence, and then some years later, after playing a crucial role in winning the war against the British, in formulating the Constitution of the United States. So from his very little, but when he's 16 years old, he begins to use his pen. Silence Do-Good in Massachusetts, 16 years old. You read some of those, they have no idea who's doing it. He's sharp, he's funny. And his entire life, he uses his pen as a weapon to educate, to trap the British, to make undercover stories so people don't know what he really thinks, and attack, educate, come out with one proposal after the other. He's the key guy in coming out with proposals for everything from a library to a hospital to the first college. And he will make the proposals in depth, and then they'll go around in the neighborhoods and solicit funds and support for the different projects that he initiates. So all the time using his pen, very much like Leni today. I mean, there's hardly a day where there's not an article or a new proposal or new initiative from Benjamin Franklin's hand in form of letters, articles, essays, pamphlets, a lot of pamphlets to form the political direction. So there's also a part of him which is an integral part of his life, and that is science. And I cannot do proper respect to that today. We're going to have, when I'm done, we're going to have a few experiments that Benjamin Franklin designed. And you can do many other. I mean, everything around him that he didn't understand why things were doing the way they were doing. Like from the lights in the north, or how do you, Aurora Borealis, to oil on water, to the different temperatures or the different depths of the sea, why is that? To water spouts, to the weather formations, to you have a situation where the ovens at that time are ridiculous. It's cold on the East Coast, and they had these ovens where there'll be a lot of smoke in the rooms and no heat. The heat would go out of the chimney. So he redesigned an oven. He did experiments concerning how is air functioning, and you're going to have an experiment later today regarding that. How does it function? And then he figured out to build a new oven. And he did it so that people could use it. He made kind of illustrations with A, B, C, D, E, F, how you put the things together so people could build their own ovens. People are complaining, there's a little thing, people are complaining about that the candles cost a lot of money. So he thinks it's ridiculous. People are just sleeping in the morning. And then he makes this little funny piece where he says, look, I went late to bed last night, like 2 o'clock in the morning, and then I woke up at 6 because it was really light. There was tons of light. And I went to the window to see, where's all this light coming from? And this was the sun. The sun sends out a lot of light. And then I checked the Almanack, and lo and behold, the sun gets up at 6 and has a lot of light. I made the same experiment 3 days in a row. The sun does come up every day at 6 and there's a lot of light. So he proposes day-saving light. And he then, ridiculously, he makes these huge calculations about how many hours and how many candles and how much money all those candles cost, because people sleep in the morning and then have to use the candles at night. So with everything around him, to the street lights that are dark because they have a bad construction, then he makes a new construction so that the street lights will not be all blackened up fast. So wherever, and then more important things like health. He's trying to figure out how people can be inoculated, different forms of disease prevention. He has the theory, where does colds come from? Colds come from people in little rooms that are closely locked up and no fresh air coming in. So people are giving it to each other. So anyway, I could go on and on. I mean, he's just very alive with everything. And as soon as you begin to read himself, and not any books about him, but read his own writings, you begin to get a really delightful sense of this character. So to go back from the very beginning, from he's a very young teenager, he is being picked up by key networks to be a central figure for ending up with the colonies becoming the United States of America. And I'll go through that. So 3 key people are very, very influential on Benjamin Franklin. Well, let's take this next one. I just like this picture. This is from when he's older, from France, when he was in France, because there he had problems with his scalp, and so he didn't like to have a wig on or something. So he had this little fur hat, and nobody else looked like that. But he was very, very famous, and he could do anything. So when he came there and people saw him in the fur hat and with the bifocals, nobody else had bifocals. This was his invention to build bifocals, and he has this whole description how this is good, because when you eat or whatever, you can look up at people and you can look down at the food, and this is very good. So I like this picture of him. So 3 key people to influence him was Leibniz, Cotton Mather, who was very much influenced by Leibniz, and Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift, a Irish-English writer, yeah.
Who was the second person?
Cotton Mather, C-O-T-T-O-N Mather. This is actually a whole class in itself that maybe one of you would like to take up. Jonathan Swift that really uses his pen as a weapon, and Benjamin Franklin studies him and does a lot in a similar way to Jonathan Swift, how to use it really as an axe or as a sword to move things politically from the flank and head on, making up stories to get things politically moving, and so on, including people that have died, that have not died. He gets that from Jonathan Swift too. Benjamin Franklin will do the same thing. So the crowning, as I said before, of his life, which I want to start with, is the Declaration of Independence. And LaRouche writes about that again in this article that you got today from the EIR. And I'll just read a few lines that you all know very well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a very anti-oligarchical statement. Sometimes when people know a statement very well, they kind of just think about it as words. But if you think about the content, this is the absolutely counterpole to oligarchical thinking. And a key part in that is the question about happiness. As Lin takes up in his newspaper, coming directly from Leibniz and Leibniz's refutation of Locke, who wanted property. And I wanted to underline it by just reading up a couple of points from Leibniz's paper on happiness, where this was taken from, where Leibniz says, "Virtue is the habit of acting according to wisdom. It is necessary that practice accompany knowledge. Wisdom is the science of felicity," that is happiness. Wisdom is the science of felicity. Wisdom. Wisdom. Okay. Wisdom is the science of felicity and is what must be studied above all other things. Felicity is a lasting state of pleasure. Pleasure is a knowledge of feeling or perfection, not only in ourselves, but also in others. For in this way, some further perfection is aroused in us. To love is to find pleasure in the development and perfection of another. And then in the end, Leibniz says, "It is most true as a result that one cannot know God without loving one's brother, that one cannot have wisdom without having charity, which is the real touchstone of virtue, and that one even advances one's own good in working for that of others. For it is an internal law of reason and of the harmony of things that the works of each person will follow it. Thus, the sovereign wisdom has so well regulated all things that our duty must also be our happiness, that all virtue produces its own reward." And I know this is hefty with reading up, but you will get it as I... what does Lin say in his newspaper regarding this? This was Leibniz. What does Lin say? He says, in easier words probably, "The happiness of mankind depends on the free expression of that quality of human nature which sets man and woman absolutely apart from and above all other forms of life. The individual man and woman are each rightly happy when they are free to act in promotion of creative powers of discovery of universal physical principle and the promotion of classical modes of artistic composition, powers which provide the basis for those changes which foster human progress as mankind's native, unique likeness to the Creator identifies such powers." So, and that is the pleasure and the form of happiness that is put into the what is man and what is the key characteristic of man is his capability for more and more participating in the creation process through him being absolutely different from that of all other species. This whole idea of Leibniz, a very important guy called Cotton Mather that I mentioned quickly before, he writes a book in 1710 called Essay to Do Good. And this is a handbook. This book, written in 1710, is a handbook for uniting and educating a Republican movement in the United States. And here's what he writes in this Essay to Do Good. He writes, Cotton Mather, "It is an invaluable honor to do good. It is an incomparable pleasure. A man must look upon himself as dignified and gratified by God when an opportunity to do good is put into his hands. He must embrace it with rapture, as enabling him to answer the great end of his being. That is Cotton Mather in Essay to Do Good. And as Lynn, in the same paper, said in his introduction, he said, in short, Lynn said, we exist as Cotton Mather and Benjamin Franklin forewarned us to do good. That's why we are here. It is that commitment which sets apart the constitutional principles upon which our republic was premised, apart from the governments of our well-meaning ancestors in Great Britain and continental Europe. That is what Benjamin Franklin lived his entire life. More and more developed, of course, as he got older, but that is what he represents. Like Benjamin Franklin, namely, when he's very young, I mean, a young teenager, he reads and studies that book of Cotton Mather. And he says, both when he's young and later in his life, there was no single work that he studied that had more profound impact on him, a lasting influence for his entire life, than Cotton Mather's essay to do good. And that is why we're here, to do good. So, Benjamin Franklin becomes the center figure of this Republican movement that Cotton Mather ignites by this essay. Benjamin Franklin takes up the torch, so to speak, and becomes the central figure in the Americas, but also throughout Europe for organizing, recruiting, educating such a Republican network that will help later on form the United States of America. He is the key mover and recruiter and fundraiser. If it hadn't been for Benjamin Franklin, George Washington wouldn't have had the funds to fight the war. All in science, arts, political satire, humor, and organizing people, recruiting people, and get the money. That's what Benjamin Franklin did. When he's 60, one of the things that makes it very difficult for people, where Graham Lowry is a great help in this book, is that Benjamin Franklin, his entire life, from he was 16 years old, functioned undercover most of the time, and did a lot of things secretly and with messages and so on. And when he is, I said before, already when he's 16, he starts writing these silence do good articles, and I'll not get into that, it'll be too much, but this is a part of helping Cotton Mather, because there's a big attack on Cotton Mather at that time in Massachusetts, because Cotton Mather is leading a movement to inoculate people against smallpox. And there's a whole, a mob being created against Cotton Mather, including with threats on his life and so on. And this young Benjamin Franklin, he works for his brother's printing shop. And he functions as if he's a little bit older lady writing these essays. He writes them and he slips them in under the door at night. And nobody knows in the printing shop who is writing these articles. So I'll not go into them. I mean, one of the centerpieces of it is also a very polemical attack against Howard University at that time. From this Harvard University. It's one of the things I have difficulty in. Harvard universities. When he's 6, so there's a lot. See, when he's a kid, in his father's house, Joshua Franklin, in his house, you have a lot of gathering of Cotton Mather and Cotton Mather's network. All these key guys that are conspiring regarding forming independent colonies here are meeting in Benjamin Franklin's father's house. And then there's this, if you read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, it's really weird. And you'll find a couple of times you think, what's wrong? Something is wrong. It doesn't really mix up. And then it really helps a lot when you read this book, because without also giving all the little details. When he's 16, he leaves Boston to go down to Philadelphia. And when he comes down to Philadelphia, he's dirty and he's been traveling, and he comes there with all these dirty clothes and loaves sticking out of his pocket and other clothes sticking out of his pocket, and he walks down the main street so everybody can see him, and then he goes to the central place in Philadelphia where the Quakers are getting together for a service, and he sits down there and falls asleep until somebody wakes him up. And then he gets cleaned up, and then lo and behold, immediately the next day, a guy who is the governor, Bradley, a guy that he had been recommended in New York, and he's met in New York, has taken a horse during the night, and he is there. And he knocks on the door. Benjamin Franklin immediately gets a job with a printing shop. And then this guy comes and knocks on the door, and the older guy who runs the printing shop where Benjamin Franklin is just the worker, he thinks, oh, wow, this important person has come to see me. No, he's come to see this 16-year-old kid and take him out to have a glass of Madeira, right? And so there's one thing after them. The governor of Pennsylvania, after a couple of years, sends Benjamin Franklin to England for a year and a half. And there's a whole story around that. When I first read the autobiography years ago, I couldn't figure out, it doesn't make sense. And it's a whole, I'll not go into all the details with the cover. You try to read it yourself and then read Graham's book and just have fun with it. But it's clear if you read the later letters, where, for example, at one point just before he goes to London when he's 18, he goes up to Boston, presumably to get money from his father. But he also meets with Cotton Mather for hours. That is not in his autobiography. This is first you discover that years after you read a letter that he writes to Cotton Mather's son, how much Benjamin, learned from Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father, and how much he enjoyed the meeting and learned from the meeting he had with Cotton Mather when he, as a young man, went up to Boston for the first time after he had run away from home. And it's not in the autobiography. He meets for hours with Cotton Mather before he goes to London for a year and a half, and it's not in his autobiography. It's the same thing. Another guy, when he's a young guy, 18 years old in London, he immediately gets this good job, and you don't really get what is going on. He writes this weird essay about how evil is good and good is evil, and you sit and read it and say, no, that doesn't make sense. That's not Benjamin Franklin. Well, that was an undercover story to get into the Hellfire Club with Mandeville. And he goes in and he meets with Mandeville and so on, and Mandeville tries to set up a meeting for him and Newton. And so if you just, what these books do, they take these things that Benjamin Franklin does, and say, oh, so he thinks that. And then they write a chapter 2 or 3 about that, which is just him being an undercover guy, doing undercover work to figure out what these people are up to. The Hellfire Club with Mandeville was key forces against Cotton Mather up in Massachusetts. So Benjamin Franklin was into figuring out what was up in London, and that was a key part of what he was doing. He met in London when he was a young kid, 18, 19 years old. He meets with a guy called Bolton, which is a key doctor, the right-hand man of Cotton Mather for the smallpox inoculation in Massachusetts. He doesn't write that as an autobiography book, but then when you read his letters when he's older, he says that if it wasn't for this guy, he helped me so much. If it wasn't for this guy, I would never have made it as a young man in London. I met with him continuously and so on, but nothing in the autobiography. So even the autobiography is a complete cover-up. So therefore, go to him yourself. And when I say as I go along now, if I say, I recommend you read this, I recommend you read that, it's not long things, but it's just things that will be too much to go through here. And if you have fun getting to know him more, just pick it up and read it. So, as very young, you should take a chair and come up here so you are close by. because you are on now. As from he's very young, he is not exactly an oligarch. So here he's making fun of fundamentalists, and he makes fun of titles.
On titles of honor. In old time, it was no disrespect for men and women to be called by their own names. Adam was never called Master Adam. We never read of Noah Esquire, Lot Knight, and Baronet, nor the Right Honorable Abraham. Viscount Mesopotamia, Baron of Charan. No, they were plain men, honest country graziers that took care of their families and their flocks. Moses was a great prophet, and Aaron a priest of the Lord. But we never read of the Reverend Moses, nor the Right Reverend Father in God Aaron, by divine providence, Lord Archbishop of Israel. Thou never sawest Madame Rebecca in the Bible, my Lady Rachel, nor Mary, though a princess of the blood after the death of Joseph, called the Princess Dowager of Nazareth. No, plain Rebecca, Rachel, Mary, or the widow Mary, or the like. It was no incivility then to mention their naked names as they were expressed. If common civility and a generous deportment among mankind be not put out of countenance by the profound reasoning of this author, we hope they will continue to treat one another handsomely to the end of the world. The New England Courant, February 18th, 1722.
So that is 16 years old. In this age period too, he is really trying to figure out to be better. So he puts up a project for arriving at moral perfection. So he has a whole little book he makes up to measure himself day for day and week for week, how he can be better. He has 13 points. Nick is going in a second to go through some of them. But he has 13 points to reach perfection or improve himself. And he finds that he tries first to do all 13 at the same time, and he finds that's impossible. So then he decides to take one and then add another one and see how well he's doing. And it's funny if you read what he writes about. He said, oh my God, and I added number 4, and then the first 2 points completely I couldn't do the first 2 points. So anyway, here is, as a young kid, 16 years old, this is how, oh, hold on, here we go.
Virtues to practice. 1. Temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. 2. Silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. 3. Order. Let all your things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. 4. Resolution. Resolve to perform what you ought. Perform without fail what you resolve. 5. Frugality. Make no expense but to do good to others or yourself, i.e., waste nothing. 6. Industry. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. So,
Chastity, look at that one.
12.
Yeah.
Chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring. Never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. 13. Huh? I just couldn't wait to get to chastity. I don't know. Leni just wanted me to read some of them.
There's a lot to read, that's why. I mean, we can take them all if you want to. It's okay.
Yeah? Okay, I'm sorry. Let me go back. 7. Sincerity. Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly. And if you speak, speak accordingly. 8. Justice. Wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty. 9. Moderation. Avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. 10. Cleanliness. Tolerate no uncleanness in body, clothes, or habitation. 11. Tranquility. Be not disturbed at trifles, or at accidents common or unavoidable. 12. Chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring. Never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. And 13. Humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates.
So this is Benjamin as a young teenager. That is his project. And actually for years he works on these points. When he is 22 years old, he starts a newspaper. And when he's 23, and of course this newspaper, I mean, every single issue there's articles by him, either with his own name or he writes under pseudonyms. When he's 23, he writes a paper that I know that Harley went through earlier this year with you. 23 years old. Nature, the nature and necessity of a paper currency. And he will come back to this again and again, and including what should be on the money and also on the coins and so forth, because Britain does not want that, because that will be part of taking independence of the economy of the colonies. He also has one when he's young, in his early 20s, rules and maxims for promoting matrimonial happiness. What do you think the key thing is for a young man? What would he write? What is the rule? What is the key rules? Number 1 rule for happiness in a marriage?
Get an obedient wife.
Yeah, you got it. So he also has he has an article called Compassion and Regard for the Sick, which I found was a very beautiful article. That's also when he's in the early 20s, where he talks about that nobody is incapable of avoiding diseases. And he talks about the poor and the old, and compared to the Good Samaritan and Jesus, and how people really have to care for the sick. And later on, so that's as a young kid, and then later on in his 40s, he takes initiative, I'll come to that later, but he takes initiative to make the first hospital. He makes the proposal and he initiated, he raises the funds to create the first hospital, which is in Pennsylvania. So at 21, and think about the limb today. It's have in the back of your head all the time Leibniz on felicity, on happiness, Cotton Mather, Essay to Do Good, which Benjamin said was the key influence for him his entire life. And then what Lynn said in this article, to do good, this is why we exist. Huh? And you have this new experiment building up. It's still not a nation. When he's 21 years old, he creates a club. And the idea for that club is to have a mutual improvement. That is, that the members of the club help each other to improve for the sake of others. And some of you have heard about it. He called it the junto. And the maximum amount of members that could be in it was 12. And then later on he said to people, okay, you that are now members of the junto, you form other juntos, but don't let people know that you're already a member of one. And they have to be somewhat secret, and only 12. The reason for that was that in this period already, there was a lot of agents out from Great Britain. There was a lot of efforts that anybody that could think and any efforts to have thinking people collaborating with each other crush it in one fashion or the other. So already, and while he was recruited, he was very young. I mean, 16 years old, he was already an undercover, right? And then 18 to London as an undercover agent for those Republican forces. So here he is, 21, forming this club, and is total conscious that this has to be not too what do you call it, public. So here is his rules. And we're not going to take all of them because there's a lot of rules. But here's the rules for the junto. So I think there's 24 rules. And then from what they should discuss, what they should concentrate on. And then when they are members of the junto, then there's 4 queries that they have to swear to in the end. So first, Nick will take some selected of them. And you should know, too, that this is very much modeled upon Essay to Do Good. If you look at Essay to Do Good and these points and then compared with this, some of them are like almost completely the same.
Rules for the junto. Number 1. Have you met with anything in the author you last read remarkable or suitable to be communicated to the junto? Particularly in history, morality, poetry, physic, travels, mechanic arts, or other parts of knowledge. Number 6. Do you know of any fellow citizen who has lately done a worthy action, deserving praise and imitation, or who has committed an error proper for us to be warned against and avoid? 9. Have you or any of your acquaintance been lately sick or wounded? If so, what remedies were used and what were their effects? 11. Do you think of anything at present in which the junto may be serviceable to mankind, to their country, to their friends, or to themselves? 13.
Oh, why is it doing that?
You can, oh. There you go.
There we go.
13. Do you know of any deserving young beginner lately set up, whom it lies in the power of the junto anyway to encourage him? 14. Have you lately observed any defect in the laws of your country, of which it would be proper to move the legislature for an amendment? Or do you know of any beneficial law that is wanting? 15. Have you lately observed any encroachment on the just liberties of the people? And then at the end, there are these queries which are asked of a person, I understand, who's going to join the junto, yeah? Something of that nature. Number 2, do you sincerely declare that you love mankind in general, of what profession or religion whatsoever? Answer, I do. Number 4, do you love truth for truth's sake? And will you endeavor impartially to find and receive it yourself and communicate it to others? Answer, yes.
So this is a 21-year-old kid. He writes this 2 or 3 years later, but he forms the junto when he's 21 and then improves that. Your age, huh? So he gets things done. I mean, this that you can see with, have you met somebody who needs praise? Have you met somebody who needs encouragement? Do you have any ideas what can improve the conditions for mankind and society? So obviously the people that are part of this junto are moral young people that wants to do good, and they are collaborating with each other, so it goes pretty fast. This is like a conscious conspiracy to do good. And he gets things done. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, from he's very young, is he eats books. He reads and reads and reads. So in order to increase the possibility for reading and the literacy, he starts the U.S. First Library when he's 25. And that also is his proposal, and he puts up how it could be done, that people put down so and so much money, and then he purchases book in London and in Europe and so on, and then they have a place, and the fines and the punishment if you don't deliver the book back in time and so on. So he starts the first library in the United States of America when he's 25 years old. And also, when he's young, there's a lot of kids that die of tuberculosis and smallpox, and some periods it's like a huge percentage of the population that gets wiped out, and particularly these little children. And just for you to get a little sense of another side, he has a whole long piece where Nick is just going to read a smaller section concerning when the death of infants, which is also that he writes in his newspaper, just to give another sense of him.
The death of infants. No. The notion of annihilation has in it something so shocking and absurd, reason should despise it. Rather, let us believe that when they drop this earthly vehicle, they assume an ethereal one, and become the inhabitants of some more glorious region. May they not help people to that infinite number of starry and planetary worlds that roll above us? May they not become our better genii, our guardian angels, watch round our bed and our couch, direct our wandering paths through the maze and labyrinth of life, and at length conduct us safe, even us, who were the instruments of their passing through this valley of sorrow and death, to a land of peace and the mountains of paradise. But these are things that belong to the provinces of light and immortality, and lie far beyond our mortal ken. I was led into this train of thinking by the death of a desirable child, whose beauty is now turning apace into corruption, and all the loveliness of its countenance fled forever. Death sits heavy upon it, and the sprightliness and vigor of life is perished in every feature and in every limb. If the foregoing reflections should urge anyone forward in the paths of virtue, or yield any consolation to those in the like circumstances, and help to divert the stream of their sorrow into a better channel, I shall hope my thoughts have been employed to good purpose. When nature gave us tears, she gave us leave to weep. A long separation from those who are so near akin to us in flesh and blood will touch the heart in a painful place, and awaken the tenderest springs of sorrow. The sluices must be allowed to be held open a little. Nature seems to demand it as a debt to love. When Lazarus died, Jesus groaned and wept. Pennsylvania Gazette, June 20th, 1734.
Yeah, so he was 28 years old. So that was another side of him. So when he's 26, he starts Richard's Almanack. You all know what an almanac is? Yeah, so he's a very... There's all these sayings, and I'm not very good at them in English. Can you come with some of them? Huh? Penny saved is a penny earned. When the yeah, so there's all these things, and when the moon goes up, and when it's good to put the seed in the ground, and so on. And he reformulated a lot of the old sayings and so on, and also used it in his own way to educate when you had blank pages and so on. And on the final page, when he started his almanac, on the final page on the almanac, there was a catalog of the principal kings and princes in Europe, with the birth, with the time of their birth, and how old they were. So that was in the end of the almanac. On the very last page, Benjamin Franklin printed the birth date of Poor Richard, an American prince without subjects. And the birthday for Poor Richard, an American prince without subjects, was October 23rd, 1684, which is exactly the date when Charles II revoked and cancelled the Massachusetts Charter. That was where, from the very beginning, Massachusetts could have its own rulers, decide with their commerce and so forth. And there was a big back and forth, a big battle. So here, Benjamin Franklin has listed all these kings and princes for Europe. And then we have the Prince of America with no subjects. And his birthday is exactly that date when you already had the beginning of an opposition forming and also an urge for an independent country. It's already a seed there. So as I said before, he uses his paper for satire, education, and he hates public opinion. There's a little quote there on public opinion.
On obstinacy in opinion. It is an argument indeed of levity and weakness of mind to change our opinion upon every slight appearance, or to give it up to the authority of others. But it argues a real greatness of soul to have always a regard for truth, superior to every other consideration, and to feel an undissembled pleasure upon the discovery of it. If truth is divine and eternal, 'tis the natural homage of a reasonable mind to yield to its powerful light and embrace its lovely form wherever it appears. 'Tis superstition to be fond of an old opinion not supported by it. It is idolatry to adore the image and false appearance of it. But it is open profaneness to neglect and condemn it. The only acceptable sacrifice here is that of our darling prejudice, and the offering of an upright mind is like the perfume of incense. But a sincere and hearty lover of truth will not content himself with a mere change of his sentiments upon conviction, concealed within his own breast, but will ingeniously acknowledge his mistake, as freely and as publicly as he avowed it. The same frankness and sincerity which make me declare myself of one opinion at one time will oblige me to declare myself of another afterwards, if my sentiments are really altered. We owe this justice to mankind, as well as truth.
Veridicus.
Veridicus.
Yeah, he uses these fun pseudonyms. No, it's fine.
That means to speak the truth.
Yes, to speak the truth. Yeah. Also in his paper, he writes articles like for the common good, like protection from fire, and he starts the first fire company in America. That's when he's 29 years old. And he has a fun one you can look up. He has a fun article where he makes a dialogue up of Crito and Socrates. It's just too much to go through, and it doesn't function to tell about it. So you can look that up. It's fun. Here we have also a intervention, which is probably part of the slander that he is a womanizer and his view of women. So I would like to put two things. I have to talk a little bit in between it, though. But the first one reminds me a little bit, not fully, but a little bit of what Lynn said a few weeks ago, where Lynn said, don't masturbate, get married. So, let's go.
Old Mistresses Apologue, June 25th, 1745. My dear friend, I know of no medicine fit to diminish the violent natural inclinations you mention. And if I did, I think I should not communicate it to you. Marriage is the proper remedy. It is the most natural state of man, and therefore the state in which you are most likely to find happiness. But if you will not take this counsel, and persist in thinking a commerce with the sex inevitable, then I repeat my former advice, that in all your amours, you should prefer old women to young ones. You call this a paradox? And demand my reasons? They are these. 1, because as they have more knowledge of the world, and their minds are better stored with observations, their conversation is more improving and more lastingly agreeable. 2, because when women cease to be handsome, they study to be good. To maintain their influence over men, they supply the diminution of the beauty by an augmentation of utility. They learn to do a 1,000 services, small and great, and are the most tender and useful of all friends when you are sick. Thus, they are continuing amiable, and hence there is hardly such a thing to be found as an old woman who is not a good woman. 3, because there is no hazard of children, which irregularly produced may be attended with much inconvenience. 4,
Hold on.
Click.
4, because through more experience, they are more prudent and discreet in conducting an intrigue to prevent suspicion. The commerce with them is therefore safer with regard to your reputation. And with regard to theirs, if the affair should happen to be known, considerate people might be rather inclined to excuse an old woman who would kindly take care of a young man, form his manners by her good counsels, and prevent his ruining his health and fortune among mercenary prostitutes. 5, because in every animal that walks upright, the deficiency of the fluids that fill the muscles appears first in the highest part. The face first grows lank and wrinkled, then the neck, then the breast and arms, the lower parts continuing to the last as plump as ever. So that covering all above with a basket, and regarding only what is below the girdle, it is impossible of two women to know an old from a young one. And as in the dark all cats are gray, the pleasure of corporal enjoyment with an old woman is at least equal and frequently superior, every knack being by practice capable of improvement. 6, because the sin is less. The debauching a virgin may be her ruin and make for her life unhappy. 7, because the compunction is less. The having made a young girl miserable may give you frequent bitter reflections, none of which can attend the making of an old woman happy. 8th and lastly, they are so grateful. Thus much for my paradox. But still, I advise you to marry directly, being sincerely your affectionate friend, Benjamin Franklin.
So I want to counterpose that. He makes himself up as being Miss Polly Baker. He writes about a court case where Miss Polly Baker is in this court, and she now speak in front of the judges, and the judge that is presiding over the case, after she has spoken in the court, he does something very special that I'll tell you in the very end. This is excerpts, but you'll get it.
The speech of Miss Polly Baker.
Oh, hold on. I don't know why it's doing it. Okay.
Abstracted from the law. I cannot conceive, may it please your honors, what the nature of my offense is. I have brought 5 fine children into the world at the risk of my life. I have maintained them well by my own industry, without burdening the township, and could have done it better, if it had not been for the heavy charges and fines I have paid. Can it be a crime, in the nature of things I mean, to add to the number of the king's subjects in a new country that really wants people? I own I should think it rather a praiseworthy than a punishable action. I have debauched no other woman's husband, nor indeed any innocent youth. These things I never was charged with, nor has anyone the least cause of complaint against me, unless perhaps the minister or the justice, because I have had children without being married, by which they have missed a wedding fee. But can even this be a fault of mine? I appeal to your honors. You are pleased to allow I don't want sense, but I must be stupid to the last degree, not to prefer the honorable state of wedlock to the condition I have lived in. I always was, and still am, willing to enter into it. I doubt not my behaving well in it, having all the industry, frugality, fertility, and skill in economy appertaining to a good wife's character. I defy any person to say I ever refused an offer of that sort. On the contrary, I readily consented to the only proposal of marriage that ever was made me, which was when I was a virgin. But too easily confiding in the person's sincerity that made it, I unhappily lost my own honor, by trusting to his, for he got me with child, and then forsook me. That very person you all know. He is now become a magistrate of the county, and I had hopes he would have appeared this day on the bench, and have endeavored to moderate the court in my favor.
So then there's a whole section where she talks about how, and see, this is Benjamin doing it, so he's going after the magistrate, and also this punishing women that are having children out of wedlock, when they're not married. And then there's a whole thing about how women that get pregnant, how they try abortions and all kinds of things. They die, the children dies, and so forth, and this is not very good. And then the last part.
On the other hand, take into your wise consideration the great and growing number of bachelors in the country, many of whom, from the mean fear of the expense of a family, have never sincerely and honorably courted a woman in their lives, and by their manner of living, leave unproduced, which I think is little better than murder, hundreds of their posterity to the 1000th generation. Is not theirs a greater offense against the public good than mine? Compel them, then, by a law, either to marry or pay double the fine of fornication every year. What must poor young women do, whom custom has forbid to solicit the men, and who cannot force themselves upon husbands when the laws take no care to provide them any, and yet severely punish if they do their duty without them? Yes, gentlemen, I venture to call it a duty. 'Tis the duty of the first and great command of nature, and of nature's God, increase and multiply. A duty from the steady performance of which nothing has ever been able to deter me. But for its sake, I have hazarded the loss of the public esteem, and frequently incurred public disgrace and punishment, and therefore ought, in my humble opinion, instead of a whipping, to have a statue erected to my memory.
So Benjamin writes in his newspaper, in connection with this, that the judge presiding over the case ended up marrying her the very next day. So it's a different way of making polemic. So now we come to yes. He wrote a lot of stuff under other names. He did that his entire life, including things that he meant and things that he didn't mean, undercover and so on. And this was to stick it to the laws at that time concerning women that got children out of wedlock and so forth. So a different way of making polemic. I wanted to put it together with the male macho part, with the having sex with old women. I thought it kind of fitted well with each other. So at 37, he makes a major jump in his organizing, a very special contribution on a higher level. He has a proposal for a forming of the American Philosophical Society. And this is a kind of organization that increased matter that is Cotton Mather's father had tried to do in the 1680s. And what the idea is to find all the best, most ingenious, vigorous, virtuous minds in the colonies, and to have them collaborate with each other around ideas for the improvement of the colonies as a whole, but have it more organized in a society like the American Philosophical Society. And then he has a whole proposal how, for many pages, just having Nick read up just a very short thing, about how this is going to function, how the members have to meet once a month, and people that are too far away to come to a meeting, they should send letters so that it can be read up, and so on. And this is like as he called it, a scientific committee of correspondence. And you can imagine, you can see how this is kind of like unifying all thinking people, and how this is indispensable for also later on founding a republic. It's also crucial for having the collaboration among thinking advanced people in the forefront at that time, for later on for winning the war against the British, because you had all these good minds knowing each other and collaborating already decades before it really came to a peak in the war that George Washington led against the British on American soil. So in this proposal he also says, since Philadelphia is the center of this, he says at the meetings in Philadelphia there always should be at least 7 members, consisting of a physician, a botanist, a mathematician, a chemist, a mechanician, a geographer, a natural philosopher, plus the president, treasurer, and secretary. And so here are the subjects, and that's a little bit tedious, but just you're going to get a sense of the scope what these guys are dealing with at that time in the colonies. Here is what the subjects are for their meetings and for their correspondence.
A proposal for promoting useful knowledge. That the subjects of the correspondence be all new discovered plants, herbs, trees, roots, etc., and their virtues, uses, etc., methods of propagating them, and making such as are useful, but particular to some plantations more general. Improvements of vegetable juices, as ciders, wines, etc. New methods of curing or preventing diseases. All new discovered fossils in different countries, as mines, minerals, quarries, etc. New and useful improvements in any branch of mathematics. New discoveries in chemistry, such as improvements in distillation, brewing, assaying of ores, etc. New mechanical inventions for saving labor, as mills, carriages, etc., and for raising and conveying of water, draining of meadows, etc. All new arts, trades, manufactures, etc., that may be proposed or thought of. Surveys, maps, and charts of particular parts of the seacoasts or inland countries. Course and junction of rivers and great roads, situation of lakes and mountains, nature of the soil and productions, etc. New methods of improving the breed of useful animals, introducing other sorts from foreign countries, new improvements in planting, gardening, clearing land, etc., and all philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things. And all philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things tend to increase the power of man over matter and multiply the conveniencies or pleasures of life.
You see how the question about the general welfare is like a red thread with the hospital, the fire, library, always this question about happiness and how that fits together with the general welfare goes through all his actions his entire life. So this has a tremendous impact politically, extremely important. And also in this period, he's in the city council in Philadelphia. He becomes very, very important politically, postmaster general I mean, if you want to do political propaganda, you want to do undercover work, you want to conspire, to be postmaster general in the colonies are a very important job. He sets up things for getting the streets cleaned, for setting up night watchmen. He gets elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly in this period. And then what he's like most famous for is that he invents the lightning rod. And people are very superstitious at that time. People had not the faintest idea what was happening with the thunder and the lightning. And you can imagine how many people would have their homes burned down and die and whatnot with fires with no control at all. And as soon as the news hit Europe, what he had done, people began to set up lightning rods in France and London, and he became a member of all the different academies, the Royal Academy of London, the Royal Academy in Paris, St. Petersburg, and so forth. Not the same year, but he got very famous, and then he became Dr. Franklin. So you can make some funny experiment. You're not going to get this tonight, but there's some people say, look, Benjamin Franklin pointed out that the rods had to be, he made all kinds of experiments, that the rods had to be pointed, the lightning rod. And some of these academics in the Royal Library of Sciences in London say, oh, nonsense, they should be made stunted. So he made a lot of fun of them in letters, but he also made an experiment where he proved why they should be pointed and not stunted. And you did this experiment earlier with a Leyden jar. There's these funny letters where he writes about how in the summertime they go out and make experiments out at the lake and the rivers and so on, and how they are killing the turkeys with electricity they have produced themselves. They are frying the turkeys with electricity they produce themselves, and that they are putting alcohol on the other side of the river and then sending electricity through the water of the river and making flashes on the other side of the river with the electricity creating fires in the alcohol and so on. So that is really what makes him famous in Europe in the science communities. This is the book that is sent around with conducting which things are good conductors, plus and minus comes from him, all kinds of experiments that we should take up. This is his battery. So this is also where you had, some of you know, a lot of you know, Friedrich Schiller was very engaged in what was happening in the United States and wrote Ode to Joy, Freude schöner Götterfunken, and that Beethoven later put to music. And I'll come to that later, but that was very inspired also by Benjamin Franklin that Schiller did that. Götterfunken. Götter means gods, and Funken flashes. What was happening in the United States, where Benjamin Franklin was the center of it, and now became famous through these experiments, where you had all these slanders against, the U.S., the colonies. They're just dumb bunnies. They can't do anything. There's no scientists. They're just nothing. And so Benjamin Franklin changed all that, and through his electrical experiments and the pamphlets that were sent around, he got science collaborators throughout Europe, which were very, very important also for helping later on in the war against the British. So, what does he do too? You have a situation where the British and the French are using the Indians to go against the colonists, and killing them, taking scalps and whatnot. Like they're literally being used like cannon fodder. And The merchants, for example, in Massachusetts and down in Philadelphia, they don't care shit. They are not doing anything to help with, getting people together and protect the population and so forth. The British also not. So what Benjamin Franklin does, he takes the initiative to another proposal. He writes a proposal. The 17th of November, 1747, he writes a pamphlet, Plain Truth. And 1 week later, after that pamphlet is out, 1,200 men, which is very soon to become 10,000. But in 1 week, Benjamin Franklin mobilizes 1,200 men together and to sign that they are joining a militia of freemen. There's a whole thing, I'm not going to have it read up, there's a whole thing, what they are signing. The key part of it is reason, duty, and honor, and that when you get attacked, we have to have a mutual collaboration for protection. Which becomes, this is the very first company of where people organizing themselves, which was, of course, will be extremely important also later on for mobilizing the militias throughout the colonies against the British. And Benjamin Franklin starts that. And then the first hospital, he sends out an appeal, again, a many-page proposal for why we need a hospital to take care of the sick. And I just have a very last end, a quote, where it gives you a very good sense of how the whole thing is. And the hospital is the money is being gathered. Again, he puts the money down first, he writes the proposal, he puts the money in, and then people can go around, collect money for the hospital. His proposal is if we collect so and so much money, then Pennsylvania state should put in as much as we have put in. And it functions, and Pennsylvania has a hospital. Here's the very end from his appeal to the population for a hospital.
I was sick, and ye visited me. Matthew 25. It is hoped, therefore, that whoever will maturely consider the inestimable blessings that are connected to a proper execution of the present hospital scheme in this city can never be so void of humanity and the essential duties of religion as to turn a deaf ear to the numberless cries of the poor and needy and refuse for their assistance a little of that superfluity which a bountiful providence has so liberally bestowed on them. Pennsylvania Gazette, August 15th, 17th.
So this is from many, many pages of a detailed proposal. And then a proposal for Academy of Pennsylvania, detailed proposal. And he gets the money in, and the Philadelphia College, the first, is being built and running. So library, fire company, hospital, university, he gets it all started and initiated. One article I recommend you read is a nice one. It's Abraham to Isaac, his son Isaac. So he makes up and he writes in, and your affectionate father Abraham. That's how the letter ends, and that's also in the newspaper where this is like an older father with advice to his son Isaac concerning how it's necessary every night before you go to bed to reflect over what you did today, what good did you do today, and make resolutions what you're going to do tomorrow, not to have any hate, not to have any envy, basically regarding self-improvement, but made in a very good way. And it's getting more and more rough with the British. And one of the things that the British are doing is they are emptying out the jails and sending all the people from the jails to the colonies. So he has a gift to give back to Britain.
Rattlesnakes for felons. In some of the uninhabited parts of these provinces, there are numbers of these venomous reptiles we call rattlesnakes. Felons convict from the beginning of the world. These, whenever we meet with them, we put to death by virtue of an old law thou shalt bruise his head. But as this is a sanguinary law, it may seem too cruel. And as however mischievous those creatures are with us, they may possibly change their natures, if they were to change the climate. I would humbly propose that this general sentence of death be changed for transportation. In the spring of the year, when they first creep out of their holes, they are feeble, heavy, slow, and easily taken. And if a small bounty were allowed per head, some thousands might be collected annually and transported to Britain. There, I would propose to have them carefully distributed in St. James's Park, in the Spring Gardens, and other places of pleasure about London, in the gardens of all the nobility and gentry throughout the nation, but particularly in the gardens of the prime ministers, the lords of trade, and members of parliament, for to them we are most particularly obliged. There is no human scheme so perfect, but some inconveniencies may be objected to it. Yet when the conveniencies far exceed, the scheme is judged rational and fit to be executed. Thus inconveniencies have been objected to that good and wise act of Parliament, by virtue of which all the Newgates and dungeons in Britain are emptied into the colonies. It has been said that these thieves and villains introduced among us spoil the morals of youth in the neighborhoods that entertain them, and perpetrate many horrid crimes. But let not private interests obstruct public utility. Our mother knows what is best for us. What is a little housebreaking, shoplifting, or highway robbing? What is a son now and then corrupted and hanged? A daughter debauched and poxed, a wife stabbed, a husband's throat cut, or a child's brains beat out with an axe, compared with this improvement and well-peopling of the colonies. Yours, Americanus.
So, from 1757 to 1762, a period of 5 years, Benjamin Franklin is in England. And you don't hear very much about what he's doing. He is conspiring. Where you'll get the most is if you read his correspondence. He travels a lot in other parts. Yes?
Just had a question on this. Do you know what percentage of those who were
I
taken
have
from
tried
the
to.
jails and dumped here were
I have
from
tried to
Denmark?
ask several people also exactly what years it came, because also at a certain point they then took all of the jails from Scotland and opened them up and sent people over here. And they said all the time for peopling of the colonies, and nobody could answer me, including some of our so-called historians, because that was a question. Well, how many, which years, and so on. Some of them are political prisoners, but otherwise, and then you also had, when people came over here, they had no what do you call it? Nothing to live on. They were just so then it kind of promotes that people are committing crimes and so forth coming here. So so it's a good question. We should look it up. I have not been able to answer it. So it totally Benjamin Franklin will be in Europe for 20 years, the same as John Quincy Adams. And here he is in a period from 57 to 62. And he conspires. They have a specific coffee house in London where the people that are conspiring concerning how to build a republic in the United States meets. Scientific improvements, other improvements. He is working non-stop, collaborating and meeting with other people. And then he travels around in Europe where he's doing the same thing. But to figure out exactly what he did is not that easy. But he was not just kind of sitting down and eating and doing nothing. He was there as an agent for Massachusetts and later on for more colonies. So he was there on their behalf. He's writing one article after the other against all the different laws and taxes and so forth, increasingly that Great Britain is putting on the colonies. So this is what he's doing. What he's also doing is he likes music a lot. And so he really thinks that he heard one time he goes to a music evening and he hears a guy plays on glasses. And he thinks this is like listening to angels singing. And the way they did it that time, they would take glasses and fill them at different levels with water when they tuned them. And he thought this can be done much better. So he sends this hilarious, detailed document to a guy, an instrument maker in Italy, how to get the best glass maker, glass blower I think it's called, and how to do it, how to make it stable, how it never needs to be tuned. And I think it was about 4,000, 7,000 glass harmonicas that was produced after his instruction. And can we get number 6? So this is, he makes a whole detail. This is just a little bit of how to construct a glass harmonica. Number 6, Mozart, 7 to 8 months before he died, Mozart and Beethoven and others composed for the glass harmonica. And this is a little excerpt from Mozart 7 or 8 months before he died for 3 other instruments, flute, viola, oboe I think it is, and a glass harmonica. 6? Harmonica, yeah. We can study. So he has one himself in Philadelphia. He loves to sit and play it. It was really dangerous at that time. They didn't know it because the glass at that time was 40% lead. So yeah, here he is with his this is a little picture of him sitting there. So. But the British, when they are ransacking the colonies, are destroying all his instruments and also destroying his glass harmonica. So when he comes back from France, after the peace treaty has been signed in 1783, there's nothing left. All his papers is destroyed, his glass harmonica, all his instruments and so forth has been destroyed. So the next period he is in England is a real hot period. And so he's back for a short period, and then he's in England again from 64 to 75. And you just think about how you had the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and everything escalates concerning taxing the colonies. And so it's getting really hot, and you're going to get a few of Benjamin Franklin's intervention against the British. He uses at this time his pen again and again, article after article, to educate well-meaning Brits about why the Americans are upset, why they're angry, and otherwise satire and whatnot. You'll get a little sniff of that. Give an idea of a complete opposite camp of Benjamin Franklin is the guy called William Byrd II, who is very known if you read American history books and so forth. Not the networks around Benjamin Franklin like Spotswood and others. They're not so famous. This guy is very famous. And think about how these guys today that are so important, and they're religious, and they these neocons, how great they are, family-oriented, clean, against gay marriages, and all this. They're really clean. And here we have an example of one of these really clean guys at Benjamin Franklin, because it's the same type, oligarchical type of puppet for the oligarchy. It's the same type. So, so just as we have today.
And this is very difficult material.
Hold on. I want people to be able to follow it. Okay. It's from his diary. Okay.
I rose about 7 o'clock and read a chapter in Hebrew and some Greek in Lucian. I said my prayers and had milk for breakfast. The weather was cloudy and cold, the wind east. About 9 I paid Mr. Henny £25 for my coach. Then I danced my dance and wrote a letter to my Lady Mohun. About 11 I went to Lord Isleys, who told me the king's going to Hanover was a great hindrance to my affairs. Then I went to the Duke of Argyle's, and from thence to Lord Percival's, who was from home. Then to visit Mrs. Southwell, where I drank a dish of chocolate. Then I went home, where Sir Wilfrid Lawson came to see me, and we went to Pontock's Tavern to dinner, and I ate some boiled beef. After dinner we went to my milliner's, the woman's hat maker, and from thence to Crane Court, where we stayed till 5 o'clock. And then we went to Mrs. Pearson, who was from home. Then we went to Kensington Garden, where we walked till 8 o'clock, and then I returned and went to see my French whore, where I supped and ate some fricassee of chicken. I gave the whore 2 guineas and committed uncleanliness, and then went home in the chair and said my prayers.
It's the same species. It's the same geometry of mind. That is, if you don't have a love of mankind and think about yourself as being imbued with special creative powers, and think about the American Constitution in that way, then you think like that and you act like that, and we have it today up in space, one example after the other from these guys, these born-agains, whatnot, being like that. So the British are escalating, and so is Benjamin Franklin's attacks. And there is one quote here from a lengthy thing, from a lengthy article he wrote.
Pax quaritur beo. There are some persons besides the Americans so amazingly stupid as to distinguish in this dispute between power and right, as though the former did not always imply the latter. The right of conquest invests the conqueror with authority to establish what laws he pleases, however contrary to the laws of nature and the common rights of mankind. I would propose that all the capitals of the several provinces should be burnt to the ground, and that they cut the throats of all the inhabitants, men, women, and children, and scalp them, to serve as an example, that all the shipping should be destroyed, which will effectually prevent smuggling and save the expense of guardacostas. No man in his wits, after such terrible military execution, will refuse to purchase stamped paper. If anyone should hesitate, 500 or 600 lashes in a cold, frosty morning would soon bring him to reason. If the massacre should be objected to, as it would too much depopulate the country, it may be replied that the interruption this method would occasion to commerce would cause so many bankruptcies, such numbers of manufacturers and laborers would be unemployed, that together with the felons from our gaols, we should soon be enabled to transport such numbers to re-people the colonies, as to make up for any deficiency which example made it necessary to sacrifice for the public good. Great Britain might then reign over a loyal and submissive people. and be morally certain that no act of Parliament would ever after be disputed.
So Benjamin Franklin takes things that people have actually said, and then he just makes it really sharp and send it out there.
People know of all his pen names that it's the same guy.
No, I'll give you some examples. But they get the satire. He takes what people have said. I mean, you will get one later. This is like unbelievable. I said, I mean, that's a little bit too much. And then it turned out when I read later on his letters that indeed one of the British generals had proposed it. Yeah.
Where was this circulated?
Public advertiser in London. He's in London now. He's in London when it's really hot. When the British, this is one of these things against the stamp. There is protest in the colonies against the Stamp Act, which is a new tax. The British are putting one tax after the other on the colonies to simply suck them dry. And and then there's all kinds of proposals, articles, and so forth in London press against the colonies and what to do and so forth. So Benjamin Franklin takes some of that stuff, and then Jonathan Swift way makes it really sharp and polemical. And then, of course, the Pacificus for peace, making just an extra on it, just really show how ugly they are in that way. What you guys are doing with the propaganda regarding Lynn Cheney, and Bush and so on, same way. So he also, as I said before, in this period he sends out a lot of articles where he tries to educate. There's one article, for example, Causes of the American Discontent. He goes through how, for example, Britain sends governors over to U.S. This is people that have no money, that have kind of gambled their money away or whatever, and then they come to U.S. to get money fast, and how they have no connection to U.S., or to the colonies, how they no care about the people. They just come to rip the people off and then go back to England again. How he goes through how in U.S. at that time you're not allowed to produce hats, you're not allowed to produce nails, no manufacturing is allowed. And how people get upset about that U.S. is supposed to, or the colonies are supposed to buy all manufacturers from England. So also, for example, at that time there are rules from England that, let's say that the colonies buy something in Portugal, then they have to send it to England first to be put on extra duty from England and get inspected before they can sail over the Atlantic to the colonies. So there's all these things which are complete usurious measures that Benjamin Franklin also tries to educate people. This is what is going on, and that's why the people in the Americas are angry. So, and then you have also, there's all this disinformation that Americans are dumb, cannot do anything, like American men, they don't take care of their women. And Benjamin Franklin has an answer back. He said, what do you mean that the Americans don't take care of their women? And then he goes through how many children American women are getting. They're getting many more children than the British women. We are taking care of our women. That's like he ends. So there's another one. They say Indian corn, how you can't digest it. Americans eat Indian corn. They are raw. They are uncultured. I mean, they basically don't know how to do anything. And then they don't even have wool enough to produce one pair of stocking per person per year.
The wool of...
This is Benjamin Franklin answering that slander that America don't have any wool.
The wool of American sheep. It is objected by superficial readers, who yet pretend to some knowledge of those countries, that such establishments are not only improbable but impossible, for that their sheep have but little wool, not in the whole sufficient for a pair of stockings a year to each inhabitant, and that from the universal dearness of labor among them, the working of iron and other materials, except in plowshares, cart wheel tires, and such bulky and coarse things, is impracticable to any advantage, Dear sir, do not let us suffer ourselves to be amused with such groundless objections. The very tails of the American sheep are so laden with wool that each has a car or wagon on 4 little wheels to support and keep it from trailing on the ground.
So, and then he has really sharp, but I don't want to take too much, very sharp articles exposing the people at that time who wants war, who likes it because they earn money, the merchants, the people producing gunpowder and guns and so on. Very like Halliburton today, he has very sharp articles regarding that. And they would love to have a civil war on American ground and then just earn money from the war. And he also tries to do it in a kind of a different way, like children's stories, where he's writing fables. And Nick is going to give you 2 fables. This is all the second period in London, and you're just getting tiny little tidbits because he produces a lot in this period because it's a very hot period.
A herd of cows had long afforded plenty of milk, butter, and cheese to an avaricious farmer, who grudged them the grass they subsisted on, and at length mowed it to make money of the hay, leaving them to shift for food as they could, and yet still expected to milk them as before. But the cows, offended with his unreasonableness, resolved for the future to suckle one another. An eagle, king of birds, sailing on his wings aloft over a farmer's yard, saw a cat there, basking in the sun, mistook it for a rabbit, stooped, seized it, and carried it up into the air, intending to prey upon it. The cat, turning, set her claws into the eagle's breast, who, finding his mistake, opened his talons and would have let her drop. But puss, unwilling to fall so far, held faster. And the eagle, to get rid of the inconvenience, found it necessary to set her down where he took her up.
So, in 1773, he's still General Postmaster Benjamin Franklin, and he intercepts some letters that the governor of Massachusetts, Hutchinson, has sent to London to get harsher measures against the people in the colonies. That is, the governor of Massachusetts, Hutchinson, writes letters to the British government that they should be harder on the colonies. Benjamin Franklin intercepts those letters, and Benjamin Franklin sends them back to the colonies, those letters, and people get very mad. When that is being discovered, that Benjamin Franklin has done that, the lords in London gets very mad. And Benjamin Franklin is in 1773, he's called to the Privy Council for standing there like a school child for several hours, where one guy particularly is called Lord Witherburn, would be completely like that, and nose in air, and talk about, and you are a man of letters. Yeah, what a man of letters, because Benjamin Franklin had become a doctor, right, with the lightning rod and so forth, and indicating, of course, that he's taking letters. So, so Benjamin Franklin is fine, and he writes then a little short thing the same day when he comes back, that public servants like Hutchinson should write messages that can go for the public. And then he writes 2 things that we're not going to read up, but I'll definitely recommend that you read. He writes an article called, right after this, He writes rules. He's in London. He's sitting in London, Benjamin Franklin. He writes rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one. It's like point for point, and it is like biting. And as soon as the people in Philadelphia get to know what has been happening, they make two figures in effigy of Hutchinson and Wedderburn. And then they drive them around in carts in Philadelphia. And then they hang them. And after they have hung them, they burn them by using electricity. To really get a point, yeah. So that's the response in the colonies. And both of these that I've said that I recommend you to read is what Benjamin Franklin likes them himself too. He writes to his son these two articles I really liked. So this one, rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one. Another one he likes a lot is called An Edict from the King of Prussia. And so what he does is, edict, is that how you pronounce it? Edict? E-D-I-C-T. Edict, okay. So what he does is he takes all the rules that and taxes and so forth that Great Britain has imposed upon the colonies. And then he turns it upside down, not upside down, he doesn't turn it upside down, but he takes it and lets it be as if the King of Prussia imposes those rules on Great Britain. And you might remember with Leibniz and Hanover, the House of Hanover, how they had, how Sophie could come in and become the ruler of England if it had functioned, but she died. So there is kind of somewhat reason for it, so to speak. So basically, it's an edict. Benjamin Franklin writes it as this comes from the King of Prussia. And it's put on the front page of the newspaper as very important news. And you have, it is point for point of these rules that the King of Prussia is now imposing upon Great Britain, including all these things that everything has to go through Prussia with duties, all goods. Britain cannot produce any hats, they cannot produce any nails, the whole thing. And very serious in legal language. And then Benjamin Franklin is in this group of people, like they're doing intelligence like what we're doing. So there's one of the guys in the group who's always reading all the newspapers first thing in the morning, and then he's briefing the others about what is in the newspapers. So Benjamin Franklin is sitting there, and one of his friends come running in. My God, have you heard? Have you heard? Listen to this. And he begins to read up Benjamin Franklin's edict from Prussia. And then he goes, this is really important. This is on the front page too, and so forth. And then a little bit later, he turns to Benjamin Franklin, he comes back in and says, this must be one of your American jokes again. And then everybody starts laughing. And then they read the whole last part, laughing and laughing. But Benjamin Franklin was so happy too that he fooled one of his closest collaborators, that they thought it was a real thing. So that is his response, these two things, and I would recommend, as I said, to read it. There's another Jonathan Swift-like writing, which has some truth to it, where he just makes it extra sharp. A method is, again, he's sitting in London, and this is called, you're going to get the whole thing, because this is a little bit not good to kind of cut down. Other things have to be cut down. This is called A Method of Humbling Rebellious American Vassals.
To the printer of the Public Advertiser. Sir, permit me, through the channel of your paper, to convey to the Premier, by him to be laid before his mercenaries, our constituents, my own opinion, and that of many of my brethren, freeholders of this imperial kingdom, of the most feasible method of humbling our rebellious vassals of North America. As we have declared by our representatives that we are the supreme lords of their persons and property, and their occupying our territory at such a remote distance without a proper control from us, except at a very great expense, encourages a mutinous disposition, and may, if not timely prevented, dispose them in perhaps less than a century to deny our authority, slip their necks out of the collar, and from being slaves set up for masters, more especially when it is considered that they are a robust, hardy people, encourage early marriages, and their women being amazingly prolific. They must of consequence in 100 years be very numerous, and of course be able to set us at defiance. Effectually to prevent which, as we have an undoubted right to do, it is humbly proposed, and we do hereby give it as part of our instructions to our representatives, that a bill be brought in and passed, and orders immediately transmitted to General Clark, our commander-in-chief in North America, in consequence of it, that all the males there be castrated. He may make a progress through the several towns of North America at the head of 5 battalions, which we here, our experienced generals, who have been consulted, think sufficient to subdue America if they were in open rebellion. For who can resist the intrepid sons of Britain, the terror of France and Spain, and the conquerors of America in Germany? Let a company of Sogelders, consisting of 100 men, accompany the army. On their arrival at any town or village, let orders be given that on the blowing of the horn, all the males be assembled in the marketplace. If the corps are men of skill and ability in their profession, they will make great dispatch, and retard but very little the progress of the army. There may be a clause in the bill, to be left at the discretion of the general, whose powers ought to be very extensive, that the most notorious offenders, such as Hancock, Adams, etc., who have been the ringleaders in the rebellion of our servants, should be shaved quite close. But that none of the offenders may escape in the town of Boston, let all males there suffer the latter operation, as it will be conformable to the modern maxim that is now generally adopted by our worthy constituents, that it is better that 10 innocent persons should suffer than that one guilty should escape. It is true, blood will be shed, but probably not many lives lost. Bleeding to a certain degree is salutary. The English, whose humanity is celebrated by all the world, but particularly by themselves, do not desire the death of the delinquent, but his reformation. The advantages arising from this scheme being carried into execution are obvious. In the course of 50 years, it is probable we shall not have one rebellious subject in North America. This will be laying the axe to the root of the tree. In the meantime, a considerable expense may be saved to the managers of the opera, and our nobility and gentry be entertained at a cheaper rate by the fine voices of our own castrati, and the specie remain in the kingdom, which now, to an enormous amount, is carried every year to Italy. It might likewise be of service to our Levant trade, as we could supply the Grand Signior's seraglio, and the harems of the grandees of the Turkish dominions with cargoes of eunuchs, as also with handsome women, for which America is as famous as Circassia. I could enumerate many other advantages. I shall mention but one. It would effectually put a stop to the emigrations from this country now grown so very fashionable. No doubt you will esteem it expedient that this useful project shall have an early insertion, that no time may be lost in carrying it into execution. I am, Mr. Printer, for myself and in behalf of a number of independent freeholders of Great Britain, your humble servant, a freeholder of Old Sarum.
So there was actually a guy, I saw that in some of the letters later in Benjamin's later in his life, there was actually a guy, a British general, who proposed to take 1,000 soldiers and go to the colonies and castrate the men. So Benjamin Franklin takes this and then just makes it really Jonathan Swift sharp. And you can see again, I mean, the way they are thinking is like with Guantanamo today, and just kill them. So that is his weapon. Yeah, and he has one of his very good friends that very close. This is also what happens in history. He votes for war against the colonies, and this is what Benjamin writes to him, just to give a little.
To Wilhelm Strahan. Mr. Strahan, you are a member of Parliament, and one of that majority which has doomed my country to destruction. You have begun to burn our towns and murder our people. Look upon your hands. They are stained with the blood of your relations. You and I were long friends. You are now my enemy, and I am yours, Benjamin Franklin.
Very close friends, so that's what happens also in political warfare. So there's also a really sharp satire that I'll recommend people to read. Against a protest against German princes who sells Hessians for the war in America. So you have this contract between German princes and Great Britain where each Hessian soldier is $60, dead or alive. And then when they're first over in America, then if a Hessian dies, the German prince gets $60. If 3 Hessians dies, he also gets $60. So obviously the best thing is if the Hessian dies, right? And who can use wounded people anyway? They're not good for war. So you had one famous guy, Frederick II, not to confuse him with Frederick the Great, who earned literally millions of whatever the currency was in contracting to Britain 16,992 Hessians at this $60 per head. And he spent the income after the war that he got for all these Hessians that he had sold to have 2,000 men for 14 years working to build himself a summer house. So Benjamin Franklin thinks this is really disgusting, and so he writes this really sarcastic article regarding as if it comes from a German prince, basically saying, look, if they have a leg, that you don't amputate them, just let them die. I'm not telling you to kill them, but really they will have a much better life if they're not alive any longer after they have been maimed, right? So so he does that, and he comes back to the United States and works with fellow revolutionaries to formulate the Declaration of Independence. And after he has done that, he is sent back to France, where he will stay for 9 years, serving the colonies in France. And what he does there is, I mean, he raises money. He figures out to get gunpowder from some of his scientific collaborators, to get guns. American prisoners are being sent to London or to England, and they're not treated very well. Benjamin Franklin gives of his personal monies and have a guy up in England that can give a shilling or whatever for each American prisoners. He works with prisoner exchange, and the waters are not that safe over the Atlantic at that time. So he does all kinds of conspiracies as the key personality in supporting the effort of George Washington and company in the United States. Key people to be sent over to participate in the war and so forth. If it hadn't been for what he did in France in this period, it could not have been done. So, and that's the period where he goes to salons. Remember the picture I showed in the very beginning with the fur hat? He's very famous. His picture is all over the place. Everybody knows Benjamin Franklin. And he goes to the salons, he talks to the ladies, and that's where the whole thing comes from. He's a big womanizer. This guy is doing undercover secret things all the time. And sometimes you read in his letters, and that's when he failed. I mean, there's one letter he writes where, because the letters are picked up all the time, so when you wrote things, it had to be silly things, superficial things, and so forth, with messages in between, because if it was being picked up by the enemy, bad things would happen. So there was just a couple of things I picked up, and one letter he sends where he said, I think you'll be happy to know that the 2 precious packages have arrived safely in Norway. So that's clearly was people that has escaped. You had another one he writes to his sister about all kinds of things you don't think is very important. And then he writes, make sure not to share this letter with anybody. And it was not a very important letter, so there must have been some messages in that letter. So, but the really important thing is he raises millions for the war effort, and he gets the gunpowder and the guns and so forth, and he gets it shipped over, uniforms and whatnot. That's what he does while he is in Paris, while George Washington is using that in the colonies. There's a lot of attacks on him, a lot of maneuvers and so on. At one time, he's being accused of being a French agent. And there's efforts in the colonies to get rid of him. For sure instigated by the British, and I have not done enough work to know all the details. So it's he's a crucial sitting there holding everything together. And he, at that time, he uses a lot of humor. Every time a situation is really rough and really hard, he uses humor. A thing that Leni is very good at and uses as a weapon all the time too. And you have these French academics. And so here is an example in the middle of doing all this undercover work, raising money, gunpowder, guns, getting people to escape, whatnot. He makes fun of the academics, and we will have that in full too.
Is it France or Britain?
This is he is in France. It's probably both.
To the Royal Academy of... ...
So that's kind of like academics, you know.
Gentlemen, I have perused your late mathematical prize question, proposed in lieu of one in natural philosophy. Permit me then humbly to propose one of that sort for your consideration, and through you, if you approve it, for the serious enquiry of learned physicians, chemists, etc., of this enlightened age. It is universally well known that in digesting our common food, there is created or produced in the bowels of human creatures a great quantity of wind. That the permitting this air to escape and mix with the atmosphere is usually offensive to the company from the fetid smell that accompanies it. That all well-bred people, therefore, to avoid giving such offense, forcibly restrain the efforts of nature to discharge that wind. That so retained, contrary to nature, it not only gives frequently great present pain, but occasions future diseases, such as habitual colics, ruptures, tympanies, etc., often destructive of the constitution and sometimes of life itself. Were it not for the odiously offensive smell accompanying such escapes, polite people would probably be under no more restraint in discharging such wind in company than they are in spitting or in blowing their noses. My prize question, therefore, should be to discover some drug wholesome and not disagreeable, to be mixed with our common food or sauces, that shall render the natural discharges of wind from our bodies not only inoffensive, but agreeable as perfumes. That this is not a chimerical project and altogether impossible may appear from these considerations. That we already have some knowledge of means capable of varying that smell. He that dines on stale flesh, especially with much addition of onions, shall be able to afford a stink that no company can tolerate. While he that has lived for some time on vegetables only shall have that breath so pure as to be insensible to the most delicate noses. And if he can manage so as to avoid the report, he may anywhere give vent to his griefs unnoticed. But as there are many to whom an entire vegetable diet would be inconvenient, and as a little quick lime thrown into a jakes will correct the amazing quantity of fetid air arising from the vast mass of putrid matter contained in such places, and render it rather pleasing to the smell, who knows what the little powder of lime, or some other thing equivalent, taken in our food, or perhaps a glass of lime water, drank at dinner, may have the same effect on the air produced in and issuing from our bowels. This is worth the experiment. Certain it is also that we have the power of changing by slight means the smell of another discharge, that of our water. A few stems of asparagus eaten shall give our urine a disagreeable odor, and a pill of turpentine no bigger than a pea shall bestow on it the pleasing smell of violets. Why should it be thought more impossible in nature to find means of making a perfume of our wind than of our water? For the encouragement of this inquiry, from the immortal honor to be reasonably expected by the inventor, let it be considered of how small importance to mankind, or to how small a part of mankind, have been useful those discoveries in science that have heretofore made philosophers famous. Are there 20 men in Europe at this day the happier, or even the easier, for any knowledge they have picked out of Aristotle? What comfort can the vortices of Descartes give to a man who has whirlwinds in his bowels? The knowledge of Newton's mutual attraction of the particles of matter, can it afford ease to him who is racked by their mutual repulsion and the cruel distensions it occasions? The pleasure arising to a few philosophers from seeing a few times in their life the threads of light untwisted and separated by the Newtonian prism into 7 colors, can it be compared with the ease and comfort every man living might feel 7 times a day by discharging freely the wind from his bowels? Especially if it be converted into a perfume. For the pleasures of one sense being little inferior to those of another, instead of it pleasing to sight, he might delight the smell of those about him, and make numbers happy, which to a benevolent mind must afford infinite satisfaction. The generous soul, who now endeavors to find out whether the friends he entertains like best claret or burgundy, champagne or Madeira, will then inquire also whether they chose musk or lily, rose or bergamot, and provide accordingly. And surely, such a liberty of expressing one's sentiments and pleasing one another is of infinitely more importance to human happiness than that liberty of the press or of abusing one another, which the English are so ready to fight and die for. In short, this invention, if completed, would be, as Bacon expresses it, bringing philosophy home to men's business and bosoms. And I cannot but conclude that in comparison therewith, for universal and continual utility, the science of the philosophers above mentioned, even with the addition, gentlemen, of your figure quelconque and the figures inscribed in it, are altogether scarcely worth a farthing.
So that's how he handles tensions and the stress in the situation is through humor. And there's many others not like it, but they are all very different. So he really wants to come back to the U.S. He's getting old. And then in 1785, he's asking again and again, can I get back, can I get back? So he's crucial in getting the peace treaty. He's the one making it between England and the U.S. in 1783. But he still cannot go back. And then finally, in 1985, he's allowed to come back. 1785, I'm sorry, he's allowed to come back. And when he arrives in Philadelphia, they had the cannons out, blowing, big crowds, all the church bells are ringing. And he has thought on the way back on the ship that, and you will learn shortly that when he goes back and forth over the Atlantic also all these times, he's not just kind of relaxing. He's doing scientific experiments back and forth every time he goes over to Europe. So he thinks now, and he also does that on his last trip over, he does scientific experiments with the water, the weather, the winds, and so on. But he's definitely clear that when he comes back to America, he's going to retire and do his experiments and read and write and have no more public office. As soon as he has come back, I think it's the day after he is on American ground, he is elected president of the Pennsylvania Executive Council, and he accepts it. And then 2 years later, from May to September in 1787, he is the delegate for Pennsylvania to the Federal Constitutional Convention, where he makes several very important interventions, one of them being that they have been discussing the ideas in the Constitution, and he makes a very beautiful intervention regarding everybody should vote for this unanimously. But you should read it for yourself, because that's why I normally wouldn't do a thing where so much is being read up, but it's very difficult to get a handle of who he is without hear him expressing himself. So that's his interventions at the convention, the Constitutional Convention. I would suggest people also read. And then in the last years of his life, he is the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And he presents for the first time ever to the American Congress a remonstrance against slavery in 1789. That's the very first time that this is presented to American Congress. And I would like to end by just quickly looking at the preamble to the American Constitution, which has 6 points. And this is also one of these things where sometimes there's a tendency to just take it with the words and not really think what went into it and what is really expressed in it. In this article by Len's most recent article, he takes up how the intent of the Declaration of Independence and of the American Constitution is the same. The content is the same, it's just with different words. And he describes how the intent behind the Constitution that Franklin Delaware Roosevelt knew that that could be used to solve the crisis at FDR's time. And Len points out that it's exactly the intent what laid behind the formulation of the preamble to the American Constitution that today is our tool for solving today's crisis. So it has 6 points, so I'll read it up. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. In a very Benjamin Franklin, if you think about this, and then think about Leibniz from the very beginning, what I went through in the very beginning, and Cottonmather, his essays to do good. And then as I give him this little sniff of his life and what he did, that this idea of the notion of man, a man being the image of the Creator, that you exist to do good and to think about your prosperity, to think about others, for the general welfare for all, lived through his entire life. That was him that was his identity, as it is Lin's identity today. Benjamin Franklin was a real American, like Lin is an American. Bush is not an American. I mean, Cheney is not an American. They do not have the American. They do not follow the Constitution of the United States, and not to speak. I mean, not at all. Not the intent. They violate it all the time. So Benjamin Franklin has been called many things, like the American Prometheus who stole the thunder from the god and the scepter from the tyrants. And then very specifically what I mentioned in the beginning, that Schiller's Ode to Joy, Freude schöner Götterfunken, not only was Götterfunken, Götter meaning gods, and Funken, sparks, meant reason of man, but also very much was meant for Benjamin Franklin, who was like the image of reason and of a new century, and the celebratory state of mind that the great people in Europe were in, and being so happy about what had been accomplished with the United States. And this was known then when Beethoven put Schiller's poem to music in his Ninth Symphony, the last movement. The whole idea about the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, and what Benjamin Franklin, what a key role he had played in building up to that as a central figure, and the idea behind it was in the last movement. And one of the reasons that at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in the last movement is so moving is because that intent is there for Beethoven too, to get that across. So I think that's what I will say. So in order for you, I mean, you have to, yeah, that's the, well, that's what he's known for. That's the,
Who painted that?
I don't know. I don't think it's that great of a painting. So, any questions?
How do you say that? God and spark? How do you say that again?
Götterfunken. Götterfunken. So you have like, God is Gott. And then when it becomes plural, it's Götter. So that's gods. And Funken means sparks. Godly sparks, which is reason. But it also was the idea of Benjamin Franklin, both regarding reason, but also regarding taking the lightning, taking the lightning from the sky. Huh? So this is very perfect for you as an introduction to read if you haven't already read Lin's paper. We exist to do good. I mean, isn't that great?